Chapter 1 of this story takes place in a section that I have lovingly titled The Western Front. Battles, trenches, battles, caves, and battles. The intention for Chapter 1 is to give a basic overview of the construction of the trenches, the battles, and the issues/new technology introduced during each event. First of all, let's establish that the Western Front is the area from the English Channel to Switzerland that ran along the Belgian and French borders with Germany. The British section of the front ranged 90 miles through Belgium and northern France, and obviously the rest of the front isn't important because this course only cares about the British. To tackle the problem of the Western Front, we need to establish what the trench system is. During World War I, mankind had evolved from standing in an open field, shooting each other for a few hours, to standing in a muddy hole and shooting each other for months on end. Such progress. Trenches were good because they offered protection from the enemy and were easy to defend, especially with machine guns and barbed wire. The construction of trenches improved greatly as the war progressed. Early trenches were dug hastily or used existing ditches and banks for cover. Later trenches were really something though. They became better maintained and some included drainage, electricity and steps. In the early war, the Allied trenches were put together quickly and were vastly inferior to their German counterparts, which had been set up with the mind of defending a position for a long period of time. There were 3 rows of trenches, all connected by ones that ran in between, called communication trenches. The trench at the front line was known as the front line trench. This is where they did most of the shooting, a lot of the killing, and most of the dying. Behind that was the support trench where troops would retreat from the front line, rest before returning back. The final line was the reserve trench where troops stationed to prepare a counterattack. This isn't something that we'll ever talk about again, but it felt important to include for the trench system. World War I focused on defence and attrition to win the war. So let's talk about what made the trenches so strong and drew out the war so much. First of all, they were protected by barbed wire. This was a farming supply, which meant that people could easily get tangled up in it, and it would make a lot of noise if people tried to move it. On top of this, they added sandbags to the side of the trenches and sometimes the floor to drain water. They were also designed in an extremely confusing zigzag shape to prevent any soldiers from the opposing army that broke into the trench from being able to wipe out entire rows of troops because at some point the bullet would hit a corner. Moving on to how a soldier could defend themselves, it was usually with guns. They often had an ammo shelf dug into the side of the trench in front of them at about chest height. This made it a lot quicker for soldiers to reload the small magazines of their semi-automatic rifles. The front line would also have dugouts. These were areas dug out of the side of the trench, which made cosy little bedrooms for soldiers. Cosy in the sense that they were full of dirt, rats, and water. Some trenches may have had duckboards to keep the soldiers' feet dry from all the water that found its way into the trench from rain and the poor weather of Europe. Now that I've over-explained a trench and some of the problems and protections that they offer, we're going to move on to the big battles. Though just the important ones, otherwise we'd be here for too long. So this section is going to focus on anywhere that led to a medical advancement or just the ones mentioned in the textbook. The first major battle kicks off with a bang at a very popular place called Ypres. This was a significant place for Britain as it was close to Calais and Dunkirk, 2 essential ports for supplies to the Western Front. The first battle began in October 1914, running until November of the same year. The main issue with this location was that the soil could become easily waterlogged and flooded. These conditions made it extremely challenging for stretcher bearers to extract the wounded from the battlefield. Furthermore, it was quite unpleasant for the British as the water ran down into the British trenches as the Germans already had the higher ground in this occupation. By 1915, it was clear the Allies weren't giving up yet. The German army began to make progress, but we're talking metres and inches, not quite miles. Continuing their attempts to cut the British supply line, they resorted to the use of a new tactic. It was during the Second Battle of Ypres, between April and May 1915, that the first instance of chemical weapons were used in World War I. The German army introduced chlorine gas to the war. We'll go into the detail of the effects later on. The next major battle was the Battle of the Somme. It's probably the most notorious battle of World War I, and something everyone seems to know at least something about. It began in July 1916 and lasted until November of 1916. There were extremely high casualties on both sides of the battle, but some statistics you might want to remember are that there were 60,000 British casualties on the first day, of which 20,000 were killed. During this battle, the Allies introduced their new tanks and the creeping barrage. However, this had no real impact. By November of 1916, nearly 400,000 British casualties had died or suffered in total at this battle. This battle was something of a problem because it led to extremely high pressure on the chain of evacuation, something that we will cover later on. The regimental aid posts and dressing stations were overwhelmed, but worst affected were the stretcher bearers who could not evacuate the wounded quickly or as easily because many of the tanks that were used in the battle had left uneven ground. It was worsened by the ground being churned up by the artillery strikes used for a creeping barrage. We're almost at the end of chapter 1, which is good, because I don't think I'm doing a very good voiceover. So it's time to talk about those holes in the ground again. Not trenches, but caves. More specifically, we're going to focus on Arras. This was an area that the British had taken over in 1916 and expanded the quarries, tunnels and caves of the area to take shelter in and use them to move troops quietly towards the front lines. As they dug further, they developed more complex accommodation, fitting running water and electricity and making some of the fanciest caves ever seen in World War I. They also opened an underground hospital and operating theatres with 700 beds and a mortuary. The location of the hospital was extremely useful, as the Allies decided to launch an attack from these tunnels, which began with a lot of success. However, that success quickly ended, leaving the Allies to make little progress and have a high number of casualties which were taken straight to that hospital in the caves. The final battle that we are going to cover today is the Battle of Cambrai. This took place between November and December of 1917 and was a large-scale battle. This battle was significant due to Robertson, a doctor who created a blood depot prepared and ready to use during the battle. He stored 22 units of blood and used it to treat soldiers suffering from shock and proving that it could be an extremely useful resource. However, they quickly used up the blood, meaning that it didn't have the huge impact that it could have, though it did lead to large-scale change as they introduced blood depots for treating the wounded throughout the rest of World War I. That's the end of our first chapter of this revision series.